Dolphins wide receiver Jaylen Waddle was one of the most explosive weapons in all of football last season, but what does his outlook look like for 2023, particularly for you and your fantasy squad? That is our subject today here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast with Joe Marino. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. I want to thank you for making Locked On Dolphins your first Miami Dolphins listen of the day. Special shout out to our everydayers who are locked in on a daily basis. Today on the show, we're continuing something that we started over the weekend, which is an outlook into the fantasy scope of being a football fan, and particularly individual players on the Dolphins team and their fantasy outlooks for 2023, according to several outlets, and whether we would take the above or below on the projection for these players. And we are honoring one Jaylen Waddle with Dolphins OTAs starting yesterday, and Waddle being the first this year to debut the orange jersey. I got my own orange jersey here, and we're talking Waddle on today's episode of Locked On Dolphins, specifically his fantasy outlook. And I have ESPN and FantasyPros, and we're going to talk about what the projections say and where Jaylen Waddle's realistic 2023 outlook is going to fall in relative to those fantasy forecasts. But before we do, the first thing that we have to do is we have to put what Jaylen Waddle has done through his first 2 seasons of NFL play in proper perspective. Jaylen Waddle has been one of the most productive receivers in the history of football through his first 2 seasons of NFL play. His rookie season, he set the rookie receptions record for a single game, beating Anquan Bolden's previous record, and scoring 140 receptions, or 104 target catches on 140 receptions for 1,015 yards and 6 touchdowns. As a paltry 9.8 yards per catch, which is fitting for what the Dolphins' offense was in 2021. 2022, Mike McDaniel comes into the fray. Tyreek Hill comes into the fray. And Jaylen Waddle's targets go down by 23. He's targeted 117 times. And he posted 351 more yards than his rookie season on 29 less receptions. He doubled his yards per reception from 9.8 to 8.1. He had 8 touchdowns, 1,356 yards on 75 receptions. And this is while acknowledging that Jaylen Waddle was not the same receiver from a production standpoint when Tua Tagovailoa did not play in the 5 games that he missed. It's pretty eye-opening to consider that level of production with next to no production without Tua in the offense. The grand total of 2,371 receiving yards for Jaylen Waddle through his first 2 seasons of NFL play, and surpassing 1,000 yards in both of those first 2 seasons, puts him in very illustrious company. That is in the top 15 in the history of the NFL for most receiving yards in a player's first 2 seasons. And in the Super Bowl era, pay attention now, in the Super Bowl era, there have been 12 NFL receivers who have posted 1,000 yards in each of their first 2 seasons. Chronologically, from the furthest back on the clock until today, John Jefferson, 1978 and 1979. There were a couple of guys that did it in the 60s, but Super Bowl era. Randy Moss, 98-99. A.J. Green, 2011, 2012. Well, I got them backwards here. Marcus Colston, 2006, 2007, and now we're back to chronological order. Odell Beckham, 2014, 2015. Mike Evans, 2014, 2015. Amari Cooper, 2015, 2016. Michael Thomas, 2016, 2017. A.J. Brown, 2019, 2020. Justin Jefferson, 2020, 2021. Jamar Chase, 2021, 2022. Jaylen Waddle, 2021, 2022. Think about that. 12 receivers in the history of the Super Bowl era posted 1,000 yards in each of their first 2 seasons. And there's some dudes on this list. There's some dudes that are not on this list. And I don't want to hear about the 17th game because Jalen missed a game, so he did it in 16 games his rookie season too. Even though he needed that 16th game that he played in to sneak in. And he didn't miss a game because he was hurt. He missed a game because of COVID protocols. 12 receivers. It's in the Super Bowl era. Jaylen Waddle is on that list. Just a tremendous amount of production for the Dolphins. 15 touchdowns in his first 2 seasons. It's a shame that we had the missed opportunity for the big play in the playoff game because it felt like that was really all anybody kept talking about with Jalen at the first 2 months of the offseason was not historically how great of a producer he has been and how phenomenal of a draft selection he was for the team, but rather, he dropped a pass in the playoff game, which is a bummer. And hopefully Jalen comes in to this season fired up, and the fact that he's wearing the orange jersey for the start of OTA certainly gives you the sense that whatever he's been doing behind closed doors as a part of the team and getting ready for this season on his own is going to be fun to watch. But here's what I would like to do just for a couple of these names. We're going to put it into historical context of what year 3 of some of those other players on the list. Now, of course, Justin Jefferson went on to post 1,800 yards this season in his 3rd year in the NFL. Jamar Chase has not played a 3rd year in the NFL, and neither has Jaylen Waddle. A.J. Brown, in his 3rd season, missed 4 games, but posted about 67 receiving yards per game. That would have put him on pace to have about 1,100 yards, and he had 5 touchdowns. A down year. But in Philadelphia in year 4, 88 receptions, 1,500 yards, 11 touchdowns. So good production, although he missed a handful of games. Michael Thomas, a.k.a. the artist formerly known as Slant Boy. In his 3rd season, posted 1,400 yards, AP first team, and then posted 17,000 yards in his 4th season before the injuries have started to catch up with him. How about Amari Cooper? Pull him up as well. Down year for Amari Cooper before getting traded in his 4th year. Really felt like Amari Cooper found his second win after he got off the Raiders. That 2017 team for the Raiders was probably the worst case scenario. He ended up posting 680 receiving yards on 48 receptions. He only had a catch percentage of 50%, and he was the 3rd most targeted player on this team behind Crabtree and Jared Cook. So Amari Cooper right now is your worst case scenario as the player who did not live up to the standard he set his first 2 seasons. Odell Beckham, his 3rd season in the NFL, 1,367, 10 touchdowns, AP, 2nd team, all NFL. Mike Evans, his 3rd season through, 1,300 yards, 12 touchdowns, Pro Bowl, the list goes on and on. I don't even want to get down to Randy Moss. The point being this. The guys on that list, historically, Amari Cooper's the outlier. They have all gone on to have phenomenal 3rd seasons and 4th seasons of NFL play. Once you hit that standard, usually once you're whittled down and you're bucketed like that, the way that Jalen Waddle has been early in his career, sets a very high standard for what the rest of your career is going to look like. And we should all be very excited for what that means for Jalen Waddle. Now, what does that mean for his 3rd season? I'm glad you asked. That is what we are going to cover next here on Locked On Dolphins. But before we do, now is the perfect time to make a fast break over to FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if your first bet with FanDuel does not hit. How's that for peace of mind? Maybe not as much a big peace of mind as having Bob minding the net against the Carolina Hurricanes, as he has been standing on his head for the Florida Panthers and their push to the Stanley Cup. Shout out the Panthers. Vamos Gatos up 3-0 in the Eastern Conference Finals. And, of course, the Miami Heat also up 3-0 in the Eastern Conference Finals, looking tonight to close out the Boston Celtics. Fingers crossed that the city of Boston is in the mud. There is no better place to bet on all of the playoff action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get that no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. So I have the Jaylen Waddle forecasts up here, and we're going to start with ESPN's. ESPN ranks Jaylen Waddle right now as the NFL's 10th receiver in fantasy. I'll read you the blurb. We'll talk about the forecast, and we'll talk about why I think they're too low. Waddle has finished each of his first 2 seasons as a top 15 fantasy wide receiver, but he took very different paths each year. As a rookie in 2021, Waddle was a short-range target and caught 104 passes for 1,015 yards and 6 touchdowns. Last season, Waddle played more of a downfield role. He nearly doubled his average depth of target and led all receivers in yards per reception and yards per target, while finishing second in yards after catch with 7.0 yards after catch per reception. His reception total plummeted, but his yardage skyrocketed, and his numbers actually would have been better if Tua Tagovailoa missed less time, 287 yards and 0 touchdowns in the 5 games Tua Tagovailoa was out or left injured. That is the big asterisk that goes on Jaylen Waddle's season last year. More goal line work would be nice. He has 8 career end zone targets, but Waddle is a budding star and a featured target in a good offense. The 24-year-old is a fringe wide receiver 1. Save the fringe. I don't want to hear it. He might not get 180 targets like some of these top names do, and that's good context. Justin Jefferson in 2022 had 184 targets. Jamar Chase, although he missed time, had 134 targets. Tyreek Hill had 170 targets. Devontae Adams had 180 targets. CeeDee Lamb had 156 targets. Amon-Ra St. Brown is the only premier option last season in the Detroit Lions passing offense after they traded TJ Hawkinson, had 146 targets. Right? Jalen's not going to be in that stratosphere. But when you watch the tape, when you watch the Dolphins offense, and you see the opportunities in which the quarterback gets up to the line of scrimmage and Tyreek Hill ends up getting looks on one side of the ball, Jaylen Waddle on the other side of the formation, when the Dolphins don't put that speed on the same side of the field together, but they actually split the field, he's cooking guys. He is absolutely turning corners inside out. The people still have this perception of Jaylen Waddle based off of what he was at Alabama, and it is not an accurate depiction of the player that Jaylen Waddle is. This is one of the best route runners in the NFL. Period. One of the best route runners in the NFL. Highly explosive speed. Some of the best change of direction at the top of routes that you will see on hard angled routes. The release package is outstanding. And he's never going to get somebody's top coverage player, because everybody will take their chances covering Tyreek. So for my money, the forecast of 123 targets, which is up by 6, the receptions of 82, which is up by 7, I think you're on the right track. But they have him from a yards after catch perspective taking a dive, and his yardage going down to 1,075 yards and 6 touchdowns this year. I get 8 touchdown receptions on 75 receptions is a little lopsided, and if you want to say, well, he's going to need more receptions to equal that touchdown total, I get it. But I think if you do get backup quarterback play for the Dolphins, it'll be better than the backup quarterback play that the Dolphins got last year. Because I think Mike White is a significant upgrade in this offensive system to both Skylar Thompson and whatever we got from Teddy Bridgewater last year. And when Tua Tagovailoa was on the field, this was a 1,600-yard receiver. That's the caliber of player that this dude was playing at with Tua Tagovailoa. So I agree that the targets are going to go up. I think Waddle is going to continue to eat against CB2s. I think the receptions will go up. I don't think they're going to go through the roof, so I think between 80 and 90 receptions is probably a fair forecast. And then from a yardage perspective, that's where I have a hard time seeing the volume of touches going up and him losing over 5 yards per catch. With how explosive he is, the routes that he can run over the middle of the field, the fact that he will run away from man coverage and tear you apart, I think this yardage number needs to come up. I really do. But that's just one forecast. And I would say this for ESPN, the vast majority of these are conservative projections. Justin Jefferson is coming down over 300 yards with his projection. Cooper Kupp's going up 650, but that's because he missed a bunch of time. Missed the second half of the year last year. Jamar Chase is going up about 400, but that's because he missed a month with the hip injury last year. Tyreek Hill is going down almost 400 with his projection. Devontae Adams is break even. Stephon Diggs is going down 250. CeeDee Lamb's going down 150. So the vast majority of these top-end players, their forecast is coming down unless they missed time last year. I just don't think Jaylen Waddle is going to be the subject of that regression when he's going to be getting more touches. But of course, this is just one fantasy outlook. What about FantasyPros? That's what we're going to finish with here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. FantasyPros has another highly complimentary summary for Jaylen Waddle as a player. I'll read it first. This is from Derek Brown, and then we'll get into some of what FantasyPros has for Jaylen Waddle as a fantasy target. Jaylen Waddle enjoyed an explosive sophomore season as the underneath complement to Tyreek Hill in the Dolphins' high-flying aerial attack. Waddle was the wide receiver 12 in fantasy, ranking 10th in yards after catch across all players, 7th in receiving yards, and 11th in total touchdowns. Waddle was also 4th in yards per route run and 3rd in fantasy points per target in a point per reception basis. He's an ascending alpha wide receiver who could easily lead the Dolphins in receiving in 2023 if Tyreek Hill shows any signs of regression. Invest in second and third year wide receivers always. This is the way. I'm glad they added that last bit about third year wide receivers. Because the bucket that you are firmly putting Jaylen Waddle into with the production through his first 2 seasons, history is overwhelming that these players go on to have dynamic ends of their rookie contracts, and Jaylen Waddle is not even halfway through his rookie contract. Now the projections, the Dolphins' schedule, and we did this with Tua Tagovailoa as well, rank as a bottom 8th or a bottom 3rd of the league. 24th out of 32 teams as far as difficulty for opposing wide receivers. But I think that is important to note, again, that Waddle's going to be drawing the wide receiver 2 assignment in coverage, whether that's fair or not. Now, if some team wants to come out and say, well, we're going to stop Jaylen Waddle over Tyreek Hill, then you're giving Jaylen Waddle his proper respect, and you're not giving Tyreek Hill his due respect, and that's kind of the fun conflict that the Dolphins offense has the ability to put you in. The forecast calls for 77 touches of the football, for 1,095 yards and 6 touchdowns. So again, this model calls for a little bit less in the way of touches than ESPN. It calls for more yards per touch and the same amount of touchdowns as ESPN. Now, I'm not a math guy, right? So we're going to remove the math off the top of the head here. But if you did 1,095 yards on 77 touches, that's 14.2. That's still down 3.5 yards from what Jaylen Waddle did last year, but it's not down 5 yards. So if you put FantasyPros yards per touch at 14.2 into the range of touches that I think he's going to get, which is more in line with ESPN's, which would be like probably, let's call it 85, 90, you're talking 1,250, 1,300. I think that's the right mix. I think FantasyPros has the right yards per touch. I think ESPN has the right touch volume for Jaylen Waddle. So my fearless, I don't want to call it fearless forecast again, and you shouldn't really be taking my fantasy advice anyway, but I can be as objective as I can about the Dolphins and their players and production. I just undershot both Waddle and Hill by 200, 300 yards last year. Now, Waddle, I was closer on the yards. I undershot Tyreek on the yardage big time because I didn't think he was going to get that kind of volume. 85 touches, 90 touches, 1,250, 1,300 yards, and you can give me the over on the 6 touchdowns that both of these places are willing to give him as well. We have the Dolphins' backfield. I might try to hold out for the backfield until post-June 1st, just because there may be some post-June 1st action on the Dolphins' backfield that we've heard long rumored. We have to do Tyreek Hill. We got to do the tight end room. It'll be really fun to kind of go through the rest of these players from a fantasy outlook. And then, of course, we also have to keep our eyes on OTAs, which the Dolphins are in the midst of this week. So make sure you keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. Appreciate you guys for checking out the show. Like the video, hit subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Shout out to the everydayers who are locked in on a daily basis. I am Kyle Krabs, lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, and I'm also out of here. Make it a great rest of your day. Peace.